The Fourth Way Up. Chapter 8. The Enneagram. This is an essential and exciting part of the teaching of the Fourth Way. In Western books devoted to the Enneagram, for some reason, the principles of the Enneagram functioning are entirely omitted. The most complete study of this section of the Fourth Way was performed by a student of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, John Bennett. It is presented in his book, Enneagram Studies. The book is interesting, but does not reveal the essence of the Enneagram. Apparently, Gurdjieff kept his word, given by him in 1917 in the Caucasus, about the dissolution of the entire group and the cessation of all work. Since then, it has been impossible to find any constructive information about the Enneagram in the books of the master himself or his students. Reading modern books devoted one way or another to the Enneagram, one gets the impression that either everyone knows the teaching about the Enneagram or the authors do not know such principles at all. It is quite possible that as a result of Rodney Collins' experiments in applying the Enneagram to our planetary system, the symbols of the Enneagram notes in American books are already in different places than P.D. Ouspensky originally showed them. The meaning of the internal lines of the Enneagram is entirely unclear from these books. In this case, the teaching about the Enneagram cannot be used in reality. It is elevated to mystical knowledge, incomprehensible to the ordinary mind. The modern Russian researcher of mysticism, everyday life, and science, V.A. Malyshev, in his work Chains of Qualitative Complexity on page 206, defines the Enneagram only as a geometric figure consisting of 9 equally spaced vertices on a circle and the segments chords connecting them. From this book, it is clear that the author was misled regarding the meaning of the Enneagram by Western authors. According to the main principle of the Fourth Way, one should accept nothing that one does not understand. This principle calls for the rejection of knowledge that is not comprehended, and it seems that the Western interpretation of the Enneagram may be a case of such distortion of the Fourth Way's teachings. As a way of transmitting ideas of objective knowledge, the Enneagram expresses the concept of universal unity in diversity. This idea, according to the teaching of the Fourth Way, was found thanks to the highest form of human consciousness, objective consciousness. Naturally, when translating into the language of subjective consciousness, even in terms of the Fourth Way, there will be an excessive simplification of the idea being transmitted. Ouspensky writes, "Any attempt at literal understanding, where the speech deals with objective knowledge and the connection between unity and diversity, is doomed to failure in advance and in most cases will lead to further errors." End of quote. This is a very important provision concerning not only the Fourth Way, but all other ways where work on symbols takes place to convey objective knowledge. Therefore, we will quote a few more places from the book In Search of the Miraculous. But in the hands of the incompetent and the ignorant, however full of good intentions, the same symbol becomes an instrument of delusion. The reason for this consists in the fact that a symbol can never be taken in a final and definite meaning. In expressing the laws of the unity of endless diversity, a symbol itself possesses an endless number of aspects from which it can be examined, and it demands from a man approaching it the ability to see it simultaneously from different points of view. Symbols which are transposed into the words of ordinary language become rigid in them. They grow dim and very easily become their own opposites, confining the meaning within narrow dogmatic frames without giving it even the very relative freedom of a logical examination of a subject. The cause of this is in the literal understanding of symbols, in attributing to a symbol a single meaning. the truth is again veiled by an outer covering of lies, and to discover it requires immense efforts of negation in which the idea of the symbol itself is lost. It is well known what delusions have arisen from the symbols of religion, of alchemy, and particularly of magic, in those who have taken them literally and only in one meaning. At the same time, the right understanding of symbols cannot lead to dispute. It deepens knowledge, and it cannot remain theoretical because it intensifies the striving towards real results, towards the union of knowledge and being. That is, to great doing. Pure knowledge cannot be transmitted, but by being expressed in symbols, it is covered by them as by a veil, although at the same time, for those who desire and who know how to look, this veil becomes transparent. End of quote. The enneagram is a universal symbol of the fourth way teaching, in the form of a circle divided into 9 parts, with lines that connect them, and expressing the combination of the law of octaves and the law of 3. The enneagram is the fundamental hieroglyph of the universal language, which has as many meanings as there are levels of people. The enneagram is an organism, or we can say every organism contains an enneagram and develops according to its laws. All knowledge can be contained in the enneagram, and with its help, it can be interpreted. Quote, "And in this connection, only what a man is able to put into the enneagram does he actually know, that is, understand. What he cannot put into the enneagram, he does not understand. For the man who is able to make use of it, the enneagram makes books and libraries entirely unnecessary. Everything can be included and read in the enneagram. A man may be quite alone in the desert, and he can trace the enneagram in the sand, and in it read the eternal laws of the universe. And every time he can learn something new, something he did not know before. If 2 men who have been in different schools meet, they will draw the enneagram, and with its help, they will be able at once to establish which of them knows more, and which consequently stands upon which step, that is to say, which is the elder, which is the teacher, and which the pupil. The understanding of this symbol and the ability to make use of it give man very great power. It is perpetual motion, and it is also the philosopher's stone of the alchemists. The enneagram is a schematic diagram of perpetual motion. In order to understand the enneagram, it must be thought of as in motion, as moving. A motionless enneagram is a dead symbol. The living symbol is in motion. End of quote. In the groups of the fourth way, the enneagram is necessarily studied in motion. Students form according to the enneagram structure and move in a certain way. It is important to understand here that obtaining knowledge about the enneagram is not so difficult. The hard part is to feel this knowledge within oneself. Only then will the synthesis of knowledge and feeling give understanding. Sometimes we know a lot theoretically, but this knowledge, which has not passed to the level of feeling, does not acquire the quality of understanding. The opposite is true for people with developed being. They cannot intellectually comprehend what they feel, and therefore their thinking also does not reach the quality of understanding. This is especially characteristic of all kinds of people following the path of a monk, fakir, or shaman. P.D. Uspensky presents knowledge about the enneagram from a mathematical point of view, but we will try to show the enneagram from other sides. We will see that the law of 3 acting in the enneagram is the reason for the formation of internal lines. Along these lines, the interaction between different notes or qualitative states of the enneagram takes place. Any integral organism, in the broad sense of the word, can be considered a structure containing a full spectrum of qualities according to the law of octaves. This structure can be graphically represented in two simplified forms, as a circle and as a sinusoid, which do not contradict each other since they are projections of the spiral from above and from the side. If one part of such a spiral plays the role of a conductor of active, another of passive, and the third of neutralizing force, a certain interaction arises between these parts. By unfolding each force into a triad of forces, according to the law of three, we will get three forces for each part of the spiral. For an ascending octave, according to the direction of movement of the octave, the active force will be on the left, and the passive force on the right of the note do. The same outline will remain after forming three triangles of three forces. Based on the principle that only the hydrogens closest in magnitude can interact with each other, we designate each of the notes of the octave, according to the role it plays in the triangles of forces. This way, we obtain a certain expansion of the law of three within the law of octaves. We can see how the various notes relate to each other. We have received a particular series of interacting elements that one can correlate with the symbols of planetary influences, or in the form of numbers from 0 to 9. Dao, NN, neutralizing force of the neutralizing part, number 0, symbolized by the sign of the rising sun, circle with a dot inside. Rare, -n, passive force of the neutralizing part, symbolized by the sign of the moon, number 1. Me, ±, active force of the passive part, symbolized by the sign of Mars, number 2. N-, neutralizing force of the passive part, symbolized by the sign of Neptune, number 3. Fa, --, passive force of the passive part, symbolized by the sign of Mercury, number 4. Sol, ++, active force of the active part, symbolized by the sign of Jupiter, number 5. N+, neutralizing force of the active part, symbolized by the sign of Uranus, number 6. La, -+, passive force of the active part, symbolized by the sign of Venus, number 7. C, +N, the active force of the neutralizing part, symbolized by the sign of Saturn, number 8. Do, NN, the neutralizing force of the neutralizing part of the new octave, symbolized by the sign of the setting sun, number 9. The interaction between the parts of the enneagram occurs as follows. The active force of the passive part, ±, interacts with the active force of the active part, ++, through the active force of the neutralizing part, +N. The passive force of the active part, -+, interacts with the passive force of the passive part, -, through the passive force of the neutralizing part, -N. The active and passive parts interact with each other along two lines of communication, with the neutralizing part playing the controlling role. For completeness, we will put planetary symbols in the enneagram instead of the activity values. 10 elements, including the lower and upper door, make up the spectrum of qualities of any integral phenomenon, process, or organism. Here, we see 4 mutually balancing pairs, Re, Si, Mi, La, N-, N+, Fa, Sol. These are qualities expressed through the symbols of the musical octave, algorithm for using the enneagram. When analyzing a specific integral process using the enneagram method, it is necessary to establish a qualitative plane of consideration, define the scale of change in the density of vibrations from the lower door to the upper door, find three conductors of forces, decompose each of the forces found into three components, discover and prove the connections of these components. Of course, it is necessary to very accurately use the previously described method of applying the expanded law of three. To understand how the enneagram works, let us consider as an example the development and work of a higher educational and research institution, an academy. The plane of consideration is informational. The lower door is a person who does not have a higher education, and the upper door is a person who has reached the heights of higher education. The scale reflects the degree of education of a person. By education we mean, in accordance with the principles of the fourth way, the possession of the acquired knowledge, which is understanding. Conductors of active force are experimenters and theorists of the academy departments who produce new knowledge. Conductors of passive force are consumers of new knowledge, teachers and students of the academy. Conductors of neutralizing, organizing force are the admissions committee and the rector's office. Conductors of active force are three components: plus plus, experimenters, minus plus, theorists, plus N, scientific publications, conferences, forums, any form of discussion of the acquired knowledge. Conductors of passive force are three components: plus minus, students, minus minus, teachers, minus N, lectures, seminars, various forms of training. Conductors of neutralizing, organizing force are three components: N plus, system of career guidance and student recruitment, admissions committee; N minus, system of assessment of the quality of education, rector's office. NN is a strategic program in the field of research and higher education. Note: rare. Usually, people who enter the higher education system only have preliminary secondary school training. They base their choice on their interests plus in obtaining higher education, their current training or level of education, minus, and information N on scientific achievements published by various researchers, theorists, and popularizers of scientific knowledge. Young people with an inclination, plus, to a certain kind of science read popular literature, N, devoted to new research and prospects in the field of science that interests them. Having assessed their knowledge and resources, minus, necessary for their studies, in addition to knowledge, a lot of money is also needed for education. They set a goal for themselves, obtaining higher education and scientific qualifications in some field of science. This choice is a demand that determines the number of teachers, minus minus, of this type of knowledge. At this stage, applicants' level of knowledge or higher education, assessed as a certain density of vibrations or hydrogen, will be minimal. Here, knowledge passes from the automatic part of the intellectual center to the emotional part of the motor center. That is, the individual's verbal thinking passes into imitation of other people's actions. Note: me. Here is another category of people. These are students of different years, of different filling with knowledge. They are driven by the desire to obtain, plus knowledge, and can obey, minus, the requirements of the academic discipline, which are correlated with the program of receiving, minus N, of knowledge from the teacher. The results of students' exams are sent to the appropriate department of the scientific administration, plus N, which makes the necessary conclusions. Here, knowledge passes from the stage of imitation to the stage of rough thinking, from the emotional to the intellectual part of the motor center. Interval me, far, students, plus minus, and teachers, minus minus, interact with each other based on a specific agreement on training, N minus. Anyone who has studied and graduated from a university or some other higher education institution knows how much work, effort, and suffering he had to spend on training. Many students cannot withstand all this suffering and trials and drop out. This is the stage of real overcoming of obstacles. This interval is filled by the will of the student. For the most part, training occurs at the level of the motor center, characterized by mechanical memorization and repetition of the material received from the teacher. Only a few students try to understand the knowledge obtained. These people have a chance to move on to the next stage of their development in their chosen field of science. The rest of the gentlemen, having received a diploma of higher education, happily leave the academy. Note Fa. This is the stage of the teacher, minus minus. The most successful and talented students are invited to this place, those who are really interested in understanding knowledge. The teacher has the full knowledge of this section of science, but knowledge is not understanding. At this point, people must transform their theoretical knowledge into understanding, i.e., feeling the knowledge they have. In teaching students, the teacher transfers his knowledge from the intellectual part of the motor center to the emotional part of the emotional center, and then to the emotional part of the intellectual center. Working with students stimulates his own interest in knowledge. By explaining, showing, answering questions, and looking for answers to his own questions that arise in the learning process, the teacher begins to understand the knowledge he teaches. The teacher must desire to pass on knowledge to students, plus, and have pedagogical abilities, minus. These two forces must be correlated with each other in accordance with the request, N, coming from applicants, note Re, for the knowledge he has, note Sol. At this stage, the teacher gets involved in research work. The best teachers in institutes usually simultaneously conduct research activities. A person who has gone through the stage of questions and answers in teaching students, wanting to get answers to the incomprehensible things he encountered in the teaching process, understands the weak points of his field of science well. And since this is already a genuine researcher, he is driven by a thirst for knowledge plus, which is based on his ability to sacrifice a lot for the sake of obtaining knowledge minus. His own experience, gained at the teaching stage, makes this researcher sensitive, and therefore objective, to a constructive assessment of the field of science he is studying. N. Such criticism, coming from the most competent colleagues, and N+, directs this scientist to examine the current problems of the section of science he is studying. In this development phase, a person realizes the field of knowledge he is studying at a higher creative level. His knowledge moves from the emotional part of the intellectual center to the intellectual part of the same center. Interval Sol, La. The interaction of experimenters, plus, and theorists, minus, of science occurs at conferences, forums, on the internet, and through publications in specialized scientific literature. All of these are conductors of the third force, N+. As a result of the interaction of these two categories of scientists, new knowledge is born. The knowledge obtained will allow the entire system of education and science, as well as specific representatives of this system, to overcome the interval C, door, and move to a qualitatively new level of development. Note La. In this development phase, the former experimenter becomes a theorist who interprets the experimental data and includes them in the general structure of the studied scientific field. Here, too, the driving force is the thirst for knowledge, plus, but at a higher level than in the case of the experimenter. This desire of the scientific theorist is based on his ability to see a particular general structure of scientific knowledge and C minus something that unites them in the sum of disparate facts. This feeling of harmony and beauty of the world is in the intellectual part of the emotional center. It is to this knowledge that the enneagram refers. It accurately correlates various individual facts and shows their place and role in the general system of specific knowledge. Here, knowledge passes into the intellectual part of the emotional center. There is no direct knowledge of the enneagram in modern science. Some people only feel how naturally and unnaturally the elements of knowledge are arranged, beautifully or ugly. This is something like common sense. Everyone feels it, but cannot express it in words. It is precisely the lack of knowledge about the natural structures of development in modern science that hinders its development. Many scientific facts are accumulated, but the processing of this data is seriously slowed down due to the lack of integrating, unifying knowledge. The activity of the theorist is organized by receiving new experimental information, N. The result of this scientist's activity will be some new knowledge. It is presented to the broad scientific community in a form accessible even to non-specialists. Such knowledge is decisive for people, applicants, choosing their path to understanding the world. Note C. This place is occupied by representatives of science who have all possible completeness of knowledge and experience in this field of expertise. These are experts. They have passed all stages of development in this system of higher education. They control the processes of assimilation of information obtained by experimenters and theorists and presented by teachers to students of higher educational institutions. Then, they present their comments to experimenters. Here, a direct connection comes from theoretical scientists to teachers, in accordance with the interests of the masses of people seeking knowledge. Feedback comes from students to experts of the higher education system, who direct the interests of experimenters to the study of dark places of this science. By and large, in the heads of such leading scientists, there should be a connection of knowledge of the intellectual part of the intellectual center minus with knowledge of the intellectual part of the emotional center, plus with the help of the higher emotional center, N. The result should be a discovery. After this, the entire system will be able to move to a new level of development, to a new door. Continuing the explanation of the enneagram, we note the following points. The outer line of development, from the lower octave to the upper octave door, shows the development of individual elements of the octave. The enneagram combines two processes. The first is the interaction of the enneagram elements with each other along the internal lines. The second is movement along the line from one door to another door. A person who is skilled in the enneagram, the internal lines of which are built as an expanded law of three, is an alchemist who knows how to obtain gold from lead. An adept who has mastery of the enneagram in which the internal lines are built, as the second consequence of the law of three, is a master who owns the secret of obtaining the elixir of immortality.